So in this week's parsha, we have the mitzvah of Birchas Koyanim. Now, over here in Eretz Yisrael, it's a daily affair. In Chutz La'aretz, it's only practiced on Yomim Tovim. That's probably why, in Chutz La'aretz, they say to the Koyanim when they come down from the Duchon, they say Yasher Koyach. Over here in Eretz Yisrael, because you see things that you get used to, I guess you're not so thankful for. But probably we should be saying it over here also. In any case, it says, Vayidaber Hashem el Moshe Lemor, Daber el Aharon ve'el Bonov Lemor, Koi, Sevorchu es Bnei Yisrael, Omar Lohem. So Rashi says, Omar Lohem, Shehiyu Kulam Shoimin. In other words, it's not just that these brachas should be said by the Kohanim in the presence of the tzibur, but they have to be saying it to them. It's not about them, it's to them. Shiyu kulam shoymin. And the source is in the Sifri. Al Asar, the Sifri says, Koi sevorchu es b'nei Yisrael, sheyeh kol hakohol shoymeya, oy einoi, elo beinoi lebein atzmoi. Maybe the Kohen should just be talking to himself. Talmud loyma, omar lohem, sheyeh kol hakol shoymeya. The Gemara in Soita Daf Lamed Ches brings a similar brisa, similar but not exactly the same. The Gemara in Soita brings a brisa Tanu Rabbonon Koi Sevorchu Bekoil Rom Oy Einoi Elo Belachash Talmud Loimer Omo Elohem Ka'odam Shoyim Lechaver. No, it would seem it's the same thing that the brisa that the Gemara brings is also saying in the end of the day Ka'odam Ha'oim Lechaver. And therefore, it should be, you shouldn't be whispering, you should be saying it b'koil rom. Meaning that when the Brisa uses the expression koil rom, it's not the same as Lamoshul we have in Bikurim, in the Kriyas HaParsha of Bikurim. There's a halacha, v'anisa v'amarta. We learn from v'anisa that it means b'koil rom. Over there, the pshat is that the Kriyas HaParsha requires koil rom, not because anyone needs to hear it, not because it's being said to someone, but it's a din b'etzem in how loud the voice of the Koirei HaParsha should be. However, over here, even though the Brisa uses the expression koil rom, it would seem that we're not really asking for a certain level of loudness in the voice of the Koyanim, but we're actually saying that it needs to be heard. And since it needs to be heard, Memela, they can't whisper it. The Tur in Siman Kuf Chav Ches brings in the name of the Yerushalmi that you need to have Mu'ule Shebe Koilos, the best of voices. Loi godol, v'loi cotton, ela beinoini. So the Yerushalmi is actually saying it shouldn't be koil rom. It should be average. The Pri Chodosh in Siman Kuf Chav Ches says, V'hainu da'amrina b'gemara b'soite, oy einoi ela b'lachash, Talmud loimer omar lohem ka'odom she'omer lechaveroi. So the Gemara says, in the name of the Brisa, or maybe perhaps you should say it b'lachash. Talmud loimer omar lahem. So he says v'i koil rom dafke. If we're actually requiring koil rom, what we should be saying is, would you think that koil beinani is enough? Talmud loimer omar lahem, that you need koil rom. So says the Pri Chodosh that obviously we could understand from the Brisa, the way it's brought in the Gemara and Soita, that it agrees with the Yerushalmi, that there's no requirement of koil rom mamish, and all we're asking for is a koil beinoini, because if we would be asking for more than that, then we wouldn't say oy einoi ela belachash, we would say oy einoi ela be koil beinoini. Elavadai the maide knock at koil rom is only la'afuke lachash. So says the Pri Chodesh. Inami, no kat koil ram lefisha lefamim tzorich levarach b'koil ram. Ukegoy sham espalalim heim rabim. So in such a case, it would have to be b'koil ram. V'hainu damrinim b'sifri koi sevarchu sheyehei kol hakol shoymea. Oyeino elo beino lebein atzmoi tamad loyma omer lahem sheyeh kol hakol kulei shoymea. So the Pri Chodesh is clearly saying that there's no requirement of koil ram, and what we do require is a koil beinoni, and the basis of the koil beinoni is really in order that the people should hear. He says, so listen, that's the halacha, that the people have to hear it. He says if there's a big crowd and they can only hear it with a koil ram, then you'll have to do a koil ram. Now, it's true that in the Sifri, that doesn't at all say koil ram, and just says, sheyehei kol hakohol shoymea. It is mashma that there's no requirement in terms of the koil mitzad atzmai. But the Brisa in Soita does say koil ram. It would maybe seem that we're not just asking for everyone to hear it, but we're saying that since the Torah says Amor Lohem, which means that everyone should hear it, so Memela, we could learn from this that the voice of the Kohen shouldn't be balachash, and it should be a koil that people could hear. But now it becomes a requirement in the koil per se. And what do I mean to say? Because Lamashal, if the tzibur is deaf, would you need to have a koil ram or a koil beinoni? Or is the whole requirement that the people should hear? And when that can't be met, so then it could be done balachash. So it would seem from the way the Braise Masechta Soita tells us this din, that you need koil ram, even though the Yalfusa is ka'adam ha'omer l'chaveiroi, that from the ka'adam ha'omer l'chaveiroi, we learn something about the level of voice, even when people are not hearing. And how do I know? How do I know that there's a mitzvah of birchas kohanim even when the people are not hearing? Maybe the people hearing is ma'akiv and birchas kohanim. It's muchach, because in Soita Daf Lamed Ches Amud Beis, the Gemara says, Amar Rav Idi, Amar Rabbi Simloi, Beis HaKnesses shekulo kohanim. The only kohanim in shul. Oilam leducha, lemi mevorchim, la'achayim shebesodos. In such a case, the bracha is chal on the Eden that are out there. Now, according to the Pri Chodesh, it would seem that in such a case they could be mevarach balachash, because he's saying there's bechlal no halacha about the level of voice. The way we're saying, it could be that even though it begins with the need to be emor lohem, that they should hear it, but it also teaches us something about the level of voice, maybe. Now, in Shulchan Aruch Simon Kuf Chav Ches Sif Yodalid, the Mechaber says, Ein mevorchin elo b'loshen hakodesh, u ba'amide, u b'nesias kapayim. The Kohanim have to raise their hands. They have to say the bracha in Loshen HaKodesh. They have to be standing. U b'koil ram. The Mishnah Berurah says that koil ram, hainu b'koil beinoni. Doesn't mean ram mamish. It means beinoni, average. La'afuke b'lachash. Mikol mokem l'farmim tzorech b'koil ram mamish. You're going sham espal l'meim rabim u'bein yishihei kol hakol shemei kedem rinim b'sefri. And this is a quote from the Pri Chodesh. And then the Mishnah Berurah adds, V'hinei mishe koiloi tzorud, somebody that's hoarse, she'eino yochel ledaber b'koil beinoni, and he can't say the brachas b'koil beinoni. L'chore pashut, she'eino yochel lisakapov. He can't do it. V'toiv she'yetzei, koidem retzei. He should leave, because I'm not so sure, Vaistai, says the Mishnah Berurah, that he's potter, so toiv she'yetzei, koidem retzei. Now, this Mishnah Berurah is nimshich to what he said earlier. This Mishnah Berurah is in Sif Cotton Nun Gimel. And this is nimshich to what he said earlier in Sivkot Nun, on all the halachas of this seif. In other words, Lashon HaKodesh, Amid, and Esiyas Kapayim, and Koel Rom, he says, because through Roiva Poiskim, Ukemat Kulom, Dahani Kulu Li'ikuvehu, Va'afilu B'di'eved Lo Yotzu Binyan Acher. In other words, if a Kohen duchen sinning, or he duchen without Esiyas Kapayim, or he duchen in a different language, or he duchen not B'Koel Rom, B'Koel Beinoini, it's Afilu B'di'eved Lo Yotzu. And Mamela, the Mishnah Berurah is saying that if a Kohen is hoarse and he can't he can't bench B'Koel Beinoini, he shouldn't bench. But what's interesting is that he brought over here the Pri Chodesh, and the Pri Chodesh clearly learns the Gemara that there is Bechlal no halacha about the level of voice. And the entire din that it says over here is that the people have to hear. And the din that the people have to hear is avada not li'ikuva, as we proved from the fact that a shul that has only koyanim, the koyanim duchen, even though the mizbarchim don't hear anything because they're am shebesodos. So I'm saying that the Reisha and the Seifa and the Sifkot and the Mishnah Berurah really don't match up, because we would have to assume that the Pri Chodesh, that the Mishnah Berurah is holding, that the Pri Chodesh is masking that there's also a din in the level of the voice, and that din is ma'akiv, but there's l'chara no remez in the Pri Chodesh to such an assumption. Now in Sifkov Zayin, it says Kohen einoi rashoi lohoisif midaitoi al hashloisha psukim shel birchas kohanim. He can't add his own blessings. Besides for these three psukim, he can't add anything. V'im hoisif over al bal toisif. If the kohen added to the three psukim of birchas kohanim, he's over al bal toisif. The Bir Halacha says l'chora nira the dafke in gamzeh hoya beprisas kapayim uchahai gavna. He's only over al bal toisif if he adds the bracha in a way that it qualifies for birchas kohanim. In other words, beprisas kapayim uchahai gavna, he means to say ba'amida and b'lashon hakodesh kol advarim ha'ma'akvim b'nesiyas kapayim u'k'mosh kosav le'il b'sif yodalit zeh mikri hoisof ala mitzvah ma she'enken b'shebirich shaloi b'nesiyas kapayim or shaloi b'hachzor asponim, they weren't facing the tzibur u'kahai gavna ein zeh mikri hoisof ki im bracha ba'alma v'chein kosav b'shulchan aruch hagras v'chein muchach b'chidushay rashba Sukkah daf lamed aleph, the dafke beprisas kapayim. The Rashba doesn't talk about the other halachas, but the Rashba does talk about prisas kapayim, and he says you're only over on Bal Tosef if you gave that extra bracha with prisas kapayim. But then he says, umistama, hu adil shari dvarim hama'akvim b'nesiyas kapayim. The Maishno, even though the Rashba only mentioned prisas kapayim, probably it's true about all the dvarim hama'akvim, that if the added bracha was done without one of those conditions that are ma'akiv in birchas kohanim, you weren't over on Bal Tosef. But then says the Bir Halacha omnom mi divrei harambam mashma shaloi kedivrei, that from the Rambam is mashma not like the Rashba. Why? Shahari kosav b'hilchas tefillah ein hakohanim rashoim b'chol mokem lohoisiv bracha al shloishes apsukim kegoin Hashem Elokeinu v'yiseichem Yosef aleichem b'kayoytze boy loy b'koel ram v'loy b'lacha shenem lo yisifu alav harei delididei oivrim al Bal Tosef k'shemavarach b'lachash afal gav the koel ram hu leikuve k'mo shekasavti l'il b'Mishnah Berurah u'mistamed delididei hu adin b'loy prisas kapayim uchai gavne gam kein oivrim. So since the Mishnah Berurah assumed with certainty that koel ram is liikuva, and he sees in the Rambam that the Rambam clearly states that if the added bracha was without koel ram, you're over on Bal Tosef. So he makes a machlokes between the Rambam and the Rashba, because the Rashba says that the added bracha, if it wasn't beprisas kapayim, you're not over on Bal Tosef. So the Mishnah Berurah assumes the same holds true about shaloi b'koel ram, and the Rambam says shaloi b'koel ram you are over. Vice versa, the Rambam holds that the added bracha doesn't have to qualify for birchas kohanim. But according to what it would seem in the Pri Chodesh, that the din of Koil Rom is really not a din in the Koil itself. The ganze din of Koil Rom is Sheyishmu ha-mizborchim. So then, Avada, as I'm saying, that's not Ma'akiv, because in a Beis HaKnesset Shekulo Koyanim, we're mevorach to the Am Shebesodis, even though they don't hear, and Memela, even if we'll say that we learn from this also something about the level of the voice, it also won't be Ma'akiv, because if the Iked din of Emor Lohem is not Ma'akiv, so then the Koil that we know from Emor Lohem is also not Ma'akiv. And Memela, there's not necessarily a machlokes between the Rambam and the Rashba. It could be the Rambam is moide that if you add a bracha in a way that it doesn't qualify for Birchas Koyanim, you're not over on Bal Tosef. It's just that the Rambam says Bein bekoil ram bein belachash, because the Rambam is saying that lachash is not a ma'akiv in Birchas Koyanim. That's l'chora the pshat hayoyse poshuv. Now you know that in the Beis Halevi ala Torah, in the end of Chumash Bereshis, he writes like this: Masha Omar Chochom Echad, beBirchas Koyanim. The Koyan Echad Yochoy Loymar Birchas Koyanim. V'shar HaKoyanim Yishmu v'shemei HaKoyanim. A Chochom Echad said that one Koyan could say the Yevorechecha Hashem v'yishmorecha, and the rest of the Koyanim could be silent, listen, and be yoytze Birchas Koyanim with shemei HaKoyanim. So first says the Beis Halevi, Hine Yim Hoyo Mokon Loymakein. If this would be true, this would be very helpful if we could hold like this. Why? Because there's a Mishnah Masechtas Megillah Daf Chav Daled that says Hamafter Benovi, etc. The person who gets the kibbud to be Mafter Benovi, V'hu Poires Al Shma, he's the Baal Tefillah for Baruch Hu, V'hu Noisei Askapov, the Lo Yodanu Ma Pirusha Shel HaMishnah. The Pshit is the Kol Kohen Noisei Askapov. What does it mean that he gets the kibbutz to be Noisei Eskapov? I mean, all the Kohanim are Noisei Eskapov. So, if we will we will accept this opinion that the Shemei Kohanim and Birchas Kohanim, the very geschmack, that it means V'hu Noisei Eskapov, just like V'hu Peres Al Shema, the Hu Yomer HaPsuk and L'hoitzi Shari HaKohanim. Omnam, says the Beis Halevi, Iker Adover, it's not clear at all. The Shemei Koine Shayach Rak Bedover the Ein Tzarich by El Amir Lechudo. Shemei Koine only applies where all you need is a dibur, an amira, a talk. Aval Birchas Koinim the Tzarich Koil Ram, Koadam Oimer Lechaveiroi, Kumoy Denafkalo Ben Saitem, Mikro de Amor Lohem, Bezelo Shayach Shemei Koine. The Harei Aniyosei Shel HaKoyin HaShemei Harei Einen Nishma La'am HaShoyim. I mean, the second Kohen is listening, and he's considered Koine, he's considered as if he's talking, but nobody's hearing him. And therefore, says the Beis Halevi, Birchas Koyanim cannot be accomplished via Shemei Koine, because Emor Lohem B'koil Ram, K'adam Oimer L'chaveiroi, and you don't have that through Shemei HaKoine. The Chocham Echad that he's quoting is Mistama Reb Betzalel HaKoyin of Vilna, the brother of Reb Shlomo HaKoyin, the Cheshik Shlomo, who writes in his Sefer Reishis Bikurim about the minig of Kehillas Kodesh Trieste in Italy, and he says, Uminig Hoya, Uminig Kehillas Kodesh Hanal, the noisim kapem b'Shabbos gamkein, not only on Yom Tov but also on Shabbos. Uksha yisi shama b'chodesh elu shnas bebirchas. That's Tov Reish Chav Daled 1864. Leprat Cotton v'ispalalti sham b'Shabbos kodesh Parshas Shoftim b'Beis HaKnesset Sfardim sham kibduni oz be'ez Hashem liyas hakoyin hamavorach kol birchas hakoyinim levadi b'koil. V'chol hakoyanim shebebeis knesses she'olu imi yachad leduchen shosku V'shamu mimeni levad. Shekach hoya, shekach min hagam sham. Shekoyen echad levad mevorach lom bekov v'shari hakoyenim she'olamim ha'yoytze b'zal yidei shemei hakoyenim. And he says, Ubazeh osi shape pshote dekro, that it says in Parshas Shmini, Vayisa Aaron es yodav ala'om vayevorchem, the Yeshloimar, the bon of Shamu mimenu oz, that it was just Aaron that was the oine, and his bonim were yoitze with shemei hakoyenim. Begam pshote the masis in the Megillah, yeah, the Mishnah Megillah Daf Chav Daled. But the Beis Halevi disagrees. Now, the Netziv, also in the Chuvas Meshiv Dover holds la halacha like the Beis Halevi that Shemei Koine cannot be used in Birchas Koyanim, but for a different reason. And he says Masha'enkin beBirchas Koyanim lo shaykh Shemei Koine. The loy kemoisha shamati mechocham echad the gam Birchas Koyanim atzmo yochel haitzi. He's also coming out against this tshuva in the Reishis Bikurim. Avala emes the Birchas Koyanim eino yochel haitzi. Va'atam bo ze shamati mishum de be'inin koil rom. Usvara the Shemei Koine lo matzinu ela b'medaber levad. So this Mistama Shamati is from his Korosh Yeshiva in Volozhin, from the Beis Halevi. Velesa, he says, but that's not true. The Habikriyas HaTorah Moitzian es HaMavorech Ves HaTzibur. Afal gav de be'inon sheyikro dafke mitoich haksav. So even though there's a requirement of mitoich haksav, and l'chora the Shemei HaKoine, first of all, he's assuming that the listeners have to be Yoitze Kriyas HaTorah with Shemei HaKoine. And after he assumes that, he's asking that the listeners, I mean, they're not reading Mitoich HaKsav, it's Koine. But where's the Ksav? How could there be Yoitze Kriyas HaTorah? V'chein b'Parshas Zochedim in HaTorah likris b'Sefer k'dei Yisrael b'Perek Beis the Megillah mihodik soiv zoi zikaron b'Sefer kol mokem echad moitzi es harabim. So he's saying that you see that the listeners take on the saying of the sayer with all its details. I mean, with all the conditions. In other words, it's considered as an oine mitoich haksav. And Memela, the oine is considered, the Shemei HaKoine should be considered ka'oine b'koil rom. The gami mikra bikurim yesh lahakshis. The be'inin koil rom, va'afilu hachi echad moitzi es chaveiroi. K'mefurish b'mishnah the bikurim berigimel mishnah dalet. And therefore he's not masking with the Beis Halevi's reason for not being able to apply Shemei HaKoine to Birchas Koyanim. But he says, Elo nira hatam poshut. The Birchas Koyanim hainu tefillah. Ubetefillah, Misha Baki eino yoytze b'shel chaveiroi. Yeah, there's only a special din of tefillas atzibur, but a yochid is not moitzi a yochid b'tefillah. V'nichlal, Birchas Koyanim begimel dvarim dechoshev b'Yerushalmi. Be'eviyoi Haran Shili Rosh Hashanah the Ein Moitziim B'chas Hamazon Kriya Shema U'Tfilah. Okay, we'll see. We how did this become a B'chas Koyanim as a Tfilah? But the Netziv it argues against the Beis Halevi, and he says that the fact that you need Koil Rom and B'chas Koyanim is not a reason for not being able to use Shemei HaKoine, because we see that Shemei HaKoine works in Bikurim, in Kriyas HaParasha Bikurim, in spite of the fact that it requires Koil Rom and Kriyas HaTorah, even though it requires Mitoich HaKsav, Shemei HaKoine helps. So you see that he understood that the Beis Halevi meant to say that the Koil Rom can't be acquired via Shemei HaKoine. It's Koine, but there's no Koil Rom. And therefore he says that that's not true. The oine is considered just like the shemei is considered just like the oine, and therefore whatever the oine's dibur is, that's what the shemei has. So also the Chazon Ish in Simon Chof Tes and Arachaim understood the Beis Halevi that way, and he also asks on him from Kriyas HaMegillah and from Kiddush Ala Kois. He says only the Mekadosh is holding the Kois, and nevertheless they have what he did. So you see that all the conditions that were fulfilled by the Mekadesh are received by the Shoimim via Shomei Koine, and therefore the same thing will hold true about Koil Ram. So the Beis Halevi, I mean the Netziv and the Chazon Ish are really attacking the Beis Halevi the same way. But I heard from my Rebbe Rebel Soloveitchik that it's possible that the Beis Halevi also agrees that the Tnoei Hadibur are nishlam by the Medaber, and the Shemea is yoitze with the dibur of the Medaber. It's not like it's that the Shemea is talking, and now we have to see how he's talking. Avada, the talking is done by the talker, and the Shemea is yoitze with the talking of the talker, and therefore Avada, whatever there was by the talker, he had a kois, it was mitoich aksav, it was bekoil rum, all that Avada the Shemea Koina has. Why did the Beis Halevi say that you can't have Shemea Koina by Birchas Koyanim? That's because by Birchas Koyanim you need to be mashmiya the bracha to the shoymim. And this is not mitnoei habracha. This is the muhus of the mitzvah, to be mashmiya the bracha to the shoymim. And memela, the fact that the mavarich is mashmiya the bracha to the shoymim, that doesn't help the Shemea Koina. In other words, the Shemea Koina has the dibur just as it was. But this is not a definition in the dibur. This is the bracha. The bracha requires that it should be said to someone, and it's outside of the dibur. It's not mitnoi hadibur, and therefore Shemea Koina, it doesn't help. In Beis HaKnesset Shekul Koyanim, there's no Shmiya Samas Barchim. The Beis Halevi will be moide that one kohen could make the bracha and everybody else could be yotzei b'Shemea Koina. He's only talking when there is a kol hashemea, and then you need to be mashmiya, and therefore he's saying that it won't help. Now and Pashtus the Chazon Ish is also masking that things that are not a definition in the dibur can't be carried over. I mean to say the halacha that the kohanim have to face the tzibur. Are we going to say that the listeners that are going to be yotzei with Shemea Koina could face the wall because they get the dibur as it's being made by the medaber? That's pashut, that the din of keneged ponim is not a definition in the dibur. It's outside of the dibur. It's how the dibur should be done, how the bracha should be executed. And Mamela, the same thing holds the Beis Halevi is about the Emor Lahem. It's not about the quality of the bracha, but it's a requirement that the bracha has to be said to someone. Now, this that the Netziv says that it's like tefillah. You know, in tefillah, it says in the Yerushalmi, that tefillah you can't be yotzei with Shemea Koina. Birchas Hamazon you can't be yotzei with Shemea Koina. And Kriyas Shema, the Yerushalmi says Kriyas Shema einay bedin sheyehei kol echad mishanein ba'atzmoi. And with regards to Birchas Hamazon, that mishanene hu yivarech. And with regards to tefillah, it says, but what does it have to do with Birchas Kohanim? And how did Birchas Kohanim become a tefillah? It's kind of surprising. I mean, Birchas Kohanim is said in the middle of the Birchas Avodah, and that's because in the Mikdash, it was done during the Avodah. So we say it in the middle of the Birchas Avodah, but is it part of tefillah? Is it a tefillah b'chlal? Or is it a bracha? I mean, I want to say maybe that, you know, the bracha of Birchas Kohanim, the Gemara says is Asher Kedeshanu b'mitzvosav v'tzivanu Asher Kedeshanu b'mitzvosav shel Aharon v'tzivanu levarach Am Yisrael ba'ahava. Now, where does that come from? Where does it say in the tzivui of Birchas Kohanim that it has to be ba'ahava? So, you know, in the Chidushei Agodas Marsho over there, Daf Lamed Ches Amud Beis, he says that on an earlier Gemara that says Toiv Ayin Hu Yevorech hu yevorach, also hu yevorich. So he says that's why we give the benching of the kois of Birchas Hamazon to a toiv ayin. Ki Birchas Hamavorich tochu kefi kavonas Hamavorich, and says the Marashov who kavonas Birchas Koyanim levorchas Ham Yisrael ba'ahava the hainu bekavona ba'ayin toiva ubelev uverotzen belev. The Be'er Sheva and Soita actually says that this is based. He asks, "Vim toima ba'ahava heiche ksiva remiza b'Torah." Where does it say? V'yashleim et ksiv emor lohem molei v'amru b'medrash Tanchuma and in the Medrash Rabbah that Omar lohem has a vav. Omar lohem HaKadosh Baruch Hu l'koyanim loy mipnei shomarti lochem shetiu mevorchem es Yisrael tiu mevorchem oisa ba'angarya ubebaholis ela tiu mevorchem bekavonas halev k'dei shetishloit habracha behem. Rashi brings it Parshas Naso in the parsha. So says the Be'er Sheva v'hainu ba'ahava koloymar b'chol lev. The Magen Avraham in Siman Kuf Chav Ches brings a zoya in Parshas Naso that kol koyim deloy rocham ama, a koyim that doesn't love the people, oy ama deloy racham in lei, if the people don't love the koyim, lo yifrois yedoy lebracha la'ama. And he says, the Hainu Taima says the Magen Avraham, the tikna loyim ba'ahava kadesh yitnu hakoyanim da'atom le'oiv es Yisrael, v'gam Yisrael yevu l'koyanim. The Aruch HaShulchan says that lefize yikabel hakoyin al atzmei b'shas ma'isa habrocha le'oiv es Yisrael v'chein hatzibur le'oiv es hakoyanim. But al kol panim, what we see is that the bracha is not something that when the koyanim say these words, the bracha is chal. But be'emes, it's a personal bracha. In other words, levorech es Am Yisrael ba'ahava. It's a toiv ayin hu yevorich. It's based on the kavonas halev. So mamele shemei koine is applicable to dibur, to amira, to kriya. But this is really dvarim shebelev. It's the halacha is that you should verbalize the dvarim shebelev. It should be expressed with a bituis v'sayim. But really, the bracha is belev. It could be really that's why tefillah is also not shomei ka'oinable, because tefillah is avodah shebelev. Yeah, and avodah shebelev is not carried over with words shomei ka'oina. But where's the leif? And Mamela, this could be another explanation for why shomei ka'oina can't be used in Birchas Kohanim. But the Beis Halevi said Pashit. The Beis Halevi said Pashit that the Amor Lahem is not going to be Mekuyim when it's done with Shomei Ka'oina.